the reality with dating and with relationships is that the messiness kind of is the point, and that's where you get to these, to the most fulfilling parts.
Welcome to the Masking Tapes. I'm very excited for this episode because we are joined by Charlie Sabgir, who is the director of the Young Men's Research Project, a nonprofit that is researching political and social trends among young men. And so I am just so happy to be joined by you, Charlie.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Big fan of Masking Tapes. I joined Young Men Research Project about almost a year ago, and am a young man myself, so it's super cool getting to kind of merge what I'm seeing in my day-to-day life and what I've grown up with the actual data on what young men, and specifically 18 to 29-year-old men, are thinking about, their behaviors in politics and society, everything in between. And I feel very privileged to get to work in this space and interact with such thoughtful people like
That's
Caroline.
Awesome. That's so sweet.
I graduated from undergrad in 2024. We're very much the faces of what political strategists all around the country are talking about in terms of Gen Z and the gender gap. So super excited to dive in.
And it's great. And the Masking Tapes is all about having these conversations across the gender divide. And it doesn't feel like there's that big of a divide other than a table between us right now. But there's so much to talk about. But before we get into it, I start every episode with asking, what is one of the most challenging things about being a young man right now? And you can also choose to answer that. Or what is one of the hardest things about researching young men right now, being a young man as well?
I've seen Masking Tapes, so I knew the first one was coming. I think, to ground this in general with the work I do, we, try to be conscious that the hardest things about being a young man today are often the exact same reasons about the hardest thing about being a young woman and just being a young person overall. And when you think about Gen Z and you think about young adults today, we were the first to be thrown into this radical experiment, which was having social media thrown into us without our will as we were teenagers, as our, pathways to thinking about relationships, society, politics, our actual formation of dopamine response systems. All of that stuff was very fertile stages, and we're still unpacking how consequential and in what ways that has transformed the life of Zoomers. That said, there has been this changing trend in terms of what it means to be a man and healthy masculinity. And, the old breadwinner model obviously was flawed in so many ways. And, it's for the best of both men and women that it be entirely discarded. That said, it did provide this very easy and convenient explanation for how to be a man in society. And so as that has kind of gone out the window, there hasn't really been a clear replacement. And in fact, when you ask young men today about, what it means to be a man, the most common answer is still about being a provider for my family. And as, economic headwinds have become more and more apparent, particularly in the post-pandemic context. And again, this is not just young men, this is all young people, rising rents, the threat of AI looming large on jobs and the future of employment. When there's this instability and this mismatch of what you expect in terms of being a productive member of society and what gives you identity, and when you're not able to achieve that in terms of your job and having that money to support all the other things you care about, it does create this very pernicious mismatch. And I think that kind of coincides with all these antisocial trends that I know we're going to talk a lot about, but yeah.
I think what's interesting there is that, while young men were having a more what it means to be a young man today is it's so much more broad than what it used to mean. At some point that meant that you were going to war, and it's expanded. And at the same time, young woman, what it means to be a young woman or a woman today has expanded a lot. And it feels like there's been a very different reaction amongst young women to more expansive notions of womanhood versus young men to more expansive notions of manhood, because it used to be so clear. And I want to know from you, as a researcher in this space, how has it been both experiencing this rapid change in what the expectations of manhood are, and then also having to be coming up with these surveys to grasp that in data too?
Yeah, I think one of the blessings and curses of being a Gen Z man who's researching this space is that I have to be very cautious not to apply my own experience to the data I'm seeing and to, kind of seek out data points here and there that confirm my own lived experience or that of, the people around me. I think, one of the most discussed storylines, obviously, with young men today is the manosphere and this rise of these figures like Nick Fuentes, Clavicula, Andrew Tate, though he's kind of fading a bit into the distance. And
thank God.
Thank God, indeed. And, me personally, during high school, I very much was someone who kind of got sucked into these very self-help optimization type of podcasts, YouTube videos. And I, know so many guys my age who also did. And so I think that's been one of the more fascinating, in some ways, helpful to know that it wasn't just my own experience, but also disheartening to know of like just how kind of widespread this very optimization focused man as the center of all society and putting myself first, kind of how pervasive that is among our demographic. And, whether it's watching videos about, the perfect morning routine or gym advice, whatever, it really is fascinating to see, just how common this is with guys. And, I think when you think about masculinity today for young men, it still is very centered around, as I said, this breadwinner model and providing, but it's also very much about optimization and achievement. In many respects, there's nothing wrong with being inspired to achieve great things and contribute to society. I think where things go south is where you learn to put, material success and achievement in your wealth and your fitness, and things that are limited to yourself above all of the very less definable, but more important and beneficial goals of having healthy and fulfilling relationships and contributing to your community and feeling belonging. Because ultimately, success in the gym and the workplace, that can only go so far. And I think with a lot of young men today, we're starting to see that this narrative of being relentlessly ripped and rich has kind of taken hold. And we have a long ways to go in terms of not just with young men, but, Gen Z altogether, and kind of reorienting towards this more communal mindset.
Yeah. And I just want to take this opportunity to plug YMRP and your Substack, because I recently read on your Substack this whole piece that you were doing on the 5 to 9 and the 9 to 5, and statistically looking at what kind of content men are putting out around this. And I think there's these pursuits of, physical fitness and wealth. And oftentimes people would think, oh, those are to be able to attract women. And so speaking of relationships, I want to transition into dating and relationships. And recently The Economist was saying that we're in a relationship recession. And I think as a member of Gen Z, we both see that with whether in our friend groups or just in general of the way relationships are structured now, are maintained is completely different than generations past. And we're seeing declining rates of young folks in relationships. I think in your most recent research, or the research over this past summer, you all noted that 27% of young men have never been in a serious relationship. And we see about a third of young men are in a serious relationship. Can you tell me a little bit about what is happening within young men in relationships right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So Young Men Research Project asked 18 to 29-year-old men, nationally representative, about their experience with dating, their most recent relationships, whether they had a recent breakup, and some of the barriers that they see to forming a long-term relationship today. And so, as you said, about 27% of this group has, reported never having been in a serious relationship. Daniel Cox recently put out a stat showing just how drastic the decline has been over the past few decades in terms of high school students and young people altogether in dating. And of course, marriage is now getting moved back more and more. But when we actually asked young men about kind of what are these big holdups to forming a relationship, the number one reason was by about a 2-to-1 margin that women hold too many expectations. And I think it's first worth noting that when you're asking in a survey about something like, do you think society is unfair in XYZ way, right? Like there's this tendency to kind of just sign off on, society wronged me at some point. And so, there's too many expectations out there. But that was the number one answer. There was also this belief that society altogether has too many rules and expectations for guys like me in terms of the respondent, as well as just relationships being too much of a financial commitment, too much of a time commitment. And there was about an even split. It was about 45-43 in terms of I personally would have to change too much about myself to make a relationship work. So the data was clear that young men have no shortage of gripes in terms of dating. And I guess this shouldn't be a total surprise given that young people are dating less and less, and the science is very clear that relationships are a very fundamental part of finding meaning in life and finding purpose, far more than any achievement in work or your fitness can bring to you. And I think you and me both, just looking through social media, it shouldn't be totally surprising why there is such a long list of complaints. I recently was just watching a video with Jeremiah Smith, who's Ohio State's best wide receiver and potentially number one pick in the NFL draft next year. And he was in a podcast and he was saying, I don't have a relationship now because it's just, women. It was some way of saying basically like, women are only after XYZ thing. And there's this kind of narrative that was reflective of. And if you looked at the comment section, it very much was like just plenty of praise and like, oh yeah, Jeremiah, he's totally speaking the truth. There is this narrative and this spectrum, whether it's something like that, like women are a distraction or women are only after certain things, all the way to the Nick Fuentes and Claviculars of the world who are saying, man's looks is deterministic of everything, not just relationship success, but also success in all aspects of life. And so, when you look at the social media discourse, it very much is clear how polarized things have become. And I think, social media is an easy scapegoat for everything. And I think rightfully so. It's a rage bait machine that amplifies disproportionately just negative talk. And so that certainly does play a big role. I think Jonathan Haidt in The Anxious Generation talked a bit about how our generation, we grew up in this age of much more helicopter parenting and less about free play and just letting, your kids go hang out at the neighbor's house and, both literally and figuratively get bruises. And so in some senses, we did grow up in this age of hyper caution and much more time spent in our rooms on our phones and not enough, going out, asking someone out on a date and getting rejected. So, I think that was part and parcel of it. And then you also have to think about, the formative years for Gen Z men, specifically, I'm 24 years old. My freshman year of high school was Brett Kavanaugh's that whole circus for his nomination and really the onset of the MeToo movement. And so, thinking back to my high school years, and I know so many guys who, their own high school experiences was kind of clouded by this feeling of like, just seeing one headline after another about MeToo. And like, there was this narrative taking hold in the media that, certainly amplified by Trump coming into office around then, that like the floor is going to fall out from under you, all of a sudden just for being a man today. And so you have to be like hyper cautious of, doing anything wrong. Right. And so when you consider that context too, and kind of how, young men were entering their relationship years with all this going on, I think that all has to be considered for thinking about why exactly young men are so skeptical and, frustrated about relationships today.
And I think what's so interesting about that is like, I do think we haven't talked enough about how the Me Too movement shaped our generation's understandings of relationships. And to that, in that research, 59% of men agreed that it's too difficult to meet partners. And I think about when I was in college, the way you met people was largely online. And in that way of Tinder or whatever it may be, you knew that the other person wanted something. Like it was much more, it felt maybe a little bit more safe to be like, well, if they swiped right and I swiped right, then this is, we're clearly going in the same direction, rather than like going up to someone at a party and being like, hey, are you single? Like it just seemed too daunting and too dangerous to like broach that. At the same time, as a young woman, if I were thinking about this and I'm like, oh my God, men think that we have too high expectations because we don't want to experience assault, or like because the Me Too movement kind of outed this, permissibility of sexual assault and violence against women of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all careers. I was talking to a friend once and I asked him what's one of the hardest things about being a man. And he said, being a man in the post-Me Too era. And he was a progressive young man, but it was a very interesting moment where I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, I just feel like exactly that feeling of like the floor is going to fall out of me at any point. And I don't know. And I think there's a lot of narratives around that. What do you feel like are the biggest expectations that young men feel like are too high from young women? And like, when there's this like, cloudy, like too many expectations, what are those expectations that young men feel the pressure to live up to?
I wish we asked that in our survey. I think more anecdotally, I think stepping back a bit, you look at the most popular like podcasters, influencers, YouTubers among young men today, and they're kind of extremely right of center in terms of anti-cancel culture, everything, right? Like there's this gag reflex to any sort of policing of language. And we've, during our high school years and, maybe a bit into the pandemic era, there was more, I think, sensitivity to, what someone said in the past, their actions and whatnot. And now we're seeing the like polar opposite reaction, not just in social media, but in politics and everything, where it's like cancel culture is like the last thing that anyone wants to be accused of, partaking in. And so, I think for some guys, it is this sense of like having to bite their tongue or not, make like immature jokes or whatever it is. You look at like Shane Gillis, Theo Vaughn, some of these guys who are very popular among young men. It's just kind of like this hanging with the bros mentality, right? Like that's what's succeeding online in many respects. And so I think in terms of like just feeling like there are too many rules in general, it's not just relationships, but also just like everything. There's this backlash going on currently to, feeling constrained in any way. And part of this may have to do with the pandemic and like all of the conformity that happened around then. There's a lot of speculation about how lasting the effects of the pandemic and feelings of like left specific institutional control kind of shutting down, school activities, hanging out with your friends, whatever, and whether that's still lingering in terms of how people think about politics and the two parties and, individual liberties altogether. And so I think that's part of it. There's just this general trend with Gen Z we're seeing where there's just this much greater focus on the individual and what I alone can achieve, both among, young men and women. But I think with a lot of guys, there's this feeling that it's just like kind of a distraction from whether it's building their career or, getting ripped, whatever it is.
That women are a distraction from building a career or getting ripped, right? Or
I think for some. For some corners, yeah.
Which is interesting because earlier you also noted that like relationships are one of the greatest bringers of a sense of purpose in one's life. And so we have this idea of like, what is for young people in general, I think for young women too, it's like, what is my sense of purpose in this crazy world with so much economic and political uncertainty? And then also realizing that like relationships are, a way of finding some kind of sense of purpose. In the Survey Center on American Life's 2023 report, you see that single young men seem more open to dating than young women. 57% of men aged 18 to 34 were single at the time of that research compared to 45% of young women. Can you explain to me like why that is that more young men were single than young women?
Yeah, I myself had to do a double take when I saw that stat. When I actually looked at some other research, I saw numbers that were even more drastic than that. But nonetheless, I think the 57-45 feels about right. And I think largely it's driven by young women just dating older men at a greater rate than younger men date older women. And I think I'm not an expert in this area, but from what I've read briefly, it's it mostly just has to do with looking for guys who are more mature.
Yeah. And there is that maturity gap and that the prefrontal cortex. When I learned that there's a couple year age gap till like between young men and young women of when it fully develops, which I think is an interesting component there of why people date up or don't date up in a way. But then there's also this concept that of single folks, a higher percentage of young men are interested in dating than young women. What have you seen about young men's aspirations for relationships or fatherhood or being a spouse one day?
Yeah, it's still the most popular answers in our summer survey when we asked about a bunch of different life aspirations. Almost 2 in 3 young men said that being a father and getting married are very important to them. And I know NBC News did a poll of young men and women this past fall. The largest gap was between Trump voting young men in terms of their life goals. And our data backs this up, that the most conservative and also the most religious, those who are just more bought into the traditional institutions and ideas, are still committed to these very traditional markers of life success, whether that be owning a home, having kids, getting married. And there was a stark gap between them and Harris voting young women, also between Trump voting young men and Harris voting young men, but much less so. And with Harris voting young women, we saw conversely much more emphasis on, career success and, financial independence. And so yeah, it's, I think what we try to get across in our work is that there's so much doom and gloom around this topic, but not only do young men still value fatherhood and marriage, but most actually think that it's attainable in the near future. And there is higher optimism among, certain corners than others, particularly those, like I said, who are more religious, more conservative, but it's not just limited to them.
Yeah. And so how do you think that part of this kind of difference in expectations of young men and young women is because actually more men are looking for fatherhood than young women are looking at aspiring towards motherhood? Like, what do we do with that mismatch? How do you think this will shake out?
Isn't that the question? We were briefly talking about this before. And, I think dating is both cause and consequence of all these other trends we see going on, whether it's our political polarization or just, in general with the gender gaps that are appearing. And I think, the easy answer is everyone just go touch grass, get off your phones, get off social media and go hang out more. Obviously, it's not as simple as that. But there, I think it has to be both at the individual, the local level, as well as just a larger culture change around putting a greater emphasis on shared spaces. And, it's cliche, but bridging the gaps in terms of actually having more conversations between, boys and girls and young men and women, where all the hyperpolarization we see online and everyone's siloed into their own specific corners. We can kind of do away with that. And I think, ideally we're not in a place where one's politics is determinative of, who their partners are. But I think like you touched on, especially with dating apps, we now have this culture where there's just like this feeling of, I think overabundance was the term that the Survey Center on American Life used, the feeling that you can just like, if someone doesn't fit all of these features, or you go out on that first date with them maybe, and it didn't go as smoothly as you think, well, you can just go on to the next one.
Just swipe.
Right, exactly. And young people are, I think, fed up with that, both from a feeling of exhaustion and kind of this nostalgic longing for the days when things were simpler and maybe not the fairy tale,
Yeah. But what's interesting is I think somewhere in your research or one of the other pieces that more young women are more likely to say that they went from friendship to being in a relationship rather than compared to young men going straight into relationship without the foundation of friendship. And I think that's very interesting. I personally my boyfriend is someone who I was friends with for a while before we became, in a relationship. And I think that is something that like I, as a young woman, I'm like, oh my God, look, he saw me as a friend first and then we went into a relationship. And to me, I think that's amazing. But I think we're also seeing a gap between friendships, frankly, between young women and men, not just romantic relationships, because we are in our silos online. Like when I'm around my male friends, I'm like, can I see your phone? I just want to like go through your social media to see what your algorithm is giving you right now. And it is so different than what I'm getting. Even the ads that I get on YouTube when I'm on an account that is of a male family member versus mine is a different world. So we're experiencing different worlds. And I think to your point, this idea of like get outside and touch grass and like be in the same world together, because it's very hard to think about how to move forward when we're existing in such different spaces. But at the same time, like to your point, that without the doom and gloom, I think it's extraordinary that so many young men are aspiring towards fatherhood. Like my two younger male cousins are the most enthusiastic about parenthood out of any of the cousins in my family. And they talk about wanting to like coach their kids and be active fathers in their life, which is a huge difference than maybe what the narrative was a while ago. What do you think has caused this shift towards more aspirations of fatherhood in a different, is it a sense of purpose that you feel like it gives young men, or what is?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. And I don't have this historical trends off the top of my head. I'd be surprised if the overall numbers in terms of young men today wanting to be fathers are any larger than they have been in the past. In fact, I would guess that they've possibly declined.
That's interesting.
But that said, I think, like you said, it is this feeling of purpose. I know I have one friend who is immensely successful professionally. He's our age, and career-wise is on this perfect path, but he already knows that for him, his ultimate meaning is going to be having kids and having a family. And for him, that's mostly, I think it's partially cultural, just the way he was raised. And I think a lot of this does come back to your childhood and how that influences things later down the line. But I think, for some, it's really about achieving this feeling of greater meaning. For others, they've inherited this script, which has been so central to our life for forever, which is, having kids is the central end goal of being a man in not just America, but all of society. Yeah.
And it, like, even the way that your legacy gets passed down, like traditionally we still have it that kids' last names are their father's last names. And so this idea of continuing your lineage, your blood is, and there's all these pronatalist movements that are thinking in a very different way of how do we get more people to have more kids? But I do think that there is this sense of purpose gap. Speaking of politics, and you'd mentioned this a little bit, but how have you seen that political divides have impacted both young men in their relationships, and also over time since the 2024 elections, you all have been doing research on attitudes of young men. Where are we seeing this go? Yeah,
so I have to admit that, I think all of my guy friends were by far not of the same political persuasion, but we're all, I think, on the same side of the aisle and, for the most part in the voting booth. So I have to throw out that disclaimer. That said, I do know plenty of stories of guys who had a different political persuasion than either someone they started dating, or stories of a guy who hid, their political ideology until they were deep into a relationship with someone. And then at some point it burst into the surface and caused a rupture. And I think, the Survey Center on American Life's report was really fascinating in terms of, I can't remember if this was young men and women of different political ideologies or just Americans altogether. I think liberals were much more open to dating someone who was deemed very liberal compared to conservatives dating someone who was very conservative. And also, liberals were much less open to dating someone, I think, on the other side of the aisle compared to vice versa. And I think college-educated women were the most likely group to say that they would not date someone based on being a Trump supporter. And I think there's a lot of reasons why
I would not either.
Yeah. But I think, politics is ultimately downstream of culture, right? It's reflective of underlying social attitudes. So, when you see someone who's supporting a candidate who adheres to all these very destructive ideas that kind of go against, quite possibly one's own sense of identity, something either inherent to who they are or something they believe in so strongly, it's pretty easy to see why there is this rupture. And going back to a point you said earlier about why young women specifically are more prone to first be friends with a guy before dating. The report also mentioned how young women in particular are the most likely to have received unsolicited, sexual images or nudes. And women are cheated on at, much greater rates than men are. And so it shouldn't be a surprise exactly why that is. And when there are actually some stories there included, and just from my own experience, I know plenty of young women who felt like they jumped into something too soon or were kind of taken aback, wishing they had known the guy better before they got to a certain point.
It makes sense why young women are more hesitant to be dating right now. I, as a young woman, being 18 while the MeToo era was beginning, I was thinking, oh my God, so this is what it means to be a young woman who's in relationships or around men. And I was just like, the thought of associating with a man right now just feels kind of terrifying to me. So I remember the narrative at that time on my feed was like, fuck all men, or like screw all men. And that's part of what got me years later to start asking the question, what's one of the hardest things about being a man? Because personally, it was very hard to imagine what would be hard about being a man. And I could easily jump to what was hard about being a woman. And I think that we've lost that sense of curiosity for each other. And even it goes back to what you were saying about all these dating apps, where I could very easily be like, I want someone of this religion that does not smoke, but does do this, that's of this height. And then people are posturing in a different way on these apps than in person. And one other thing that I want to note is that now with AI, you could very easily on these apps be like, okay, this girl just sent me this, what should I respond? And then have AI craft your response for you. You send it back. That other person on the app might be so it might just be AI talking to each other basically. And then once you get in person, then you're trying to figure out who the other one really is. How do you see AI influencing relationships amongst Gen Z right now?
Well, I think the most extreme example is we're obviously seeing this rise of AI companions, and with young men and boys already porn obviously plays this significant role disproportionately for boys and men in terms of how they think about women and sex. And the lion's share of porn, right, is extremely misogynistic, and it's just completely fake in terms of everything about it. And so having that backdrop, we're now advancing into an age where you have these AI companions, and as we know, AI is getting more and more realistic by the day, by the second, who in the not too distant future are going to be completely indistinguishable from real women. And they're not only going to be completely tailored to one's appearance suiting, but also they're going to say exactly what you want in response to, what you want. They're going to respond to all of your prompts, right, in a way that's exactly fit for you. And so when you think about that, and then you enter the real dating world where relationships are messy, you're dealing with struggles that pop up randomly, you're finding out new things about one another. Like you said, there has to be this curiosity. And then you realize, oh, things are not perfect. And you pair that with Gen Z brains, just hyper dopamine monsters who are constantly craving, right, just pleasure seeking after pleasure seeking. It's easy to see where this may not be worth it. And so I think AI companions still are very much on the fringes, and we'll see how that plays out in terms of actual adoption. But that said, we are in this age, we were talking before about abundance. I know Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson would disagree with this, but we are in this age where everything just comes so easily, and pretty much anything you want, you can have at your fingertips. And so the reality with dating and with relationships is that the messiness kind of is the point, and that's where you get to these to the most fulfilling parts.
The friction is the point.
The
part that it's not easy, that someone's not going to respond automatically or quickly, or they might never respond to you. Like the whole idea of AI doesn't ghost you, because if you are talking to an AI companion that you're paying $13.99 a month to, it's picking up on your tone. It knows what you like. It'll tell you what you want to hear. You never have to send a you up text, because AI is always up. It will always respond to your message immediately. And I feel like even people are getting less patient with the 5 seconds it takes AI to respond. But all of a sudden it's that's what makes, we're recording this on the 13th of February, but that's what makes love is that it's messy. It's complicated. It is tangled. It is tragic at times. And I think these tech companies right now and AI companies are really trying to make it as smooth as possible, as frictionless as possible. And even with when we think about deep fake technologies, and you speak of porn, in the past, if you didn't like that, then you could Google something else, but you might not get exactly what you were looking for. But now with deep fake technologies, you could choose every single little thing, and you could make look like someone you want it to look like, or you can create deep fake porn of some politician or celebrity or whatever it may be. And that's just opened the floodgates of so many issues, but all of a sudden it's going to change the way we see one another. So there's a lot of big questions ahead of us in AI, but I think to me, the answer is it's going to take us going face to face with each other, and going back to those days of Tinder's not going to be a reliable source for dating information anymore, because so much can be changed. I can have my Tinder profile photo be some travel picture of some place I've never been to, but it looks incredibly realistic that it's me. So we've got a lot ahead of us. Charlie, we're now at the end of this episode, and I want to end with the question that I end every episode with, which is, what is one of the things you love about being a man? You guys should ask this in a survey sometime.
We should. Didn't come prepared to this, and I should have.
It's always interesting to me how this question is so much harder than what is something challenging about or difficult about being a man, because I do think that the permission structure is different.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. I think it's hard to disentangle this question with some of the just natural privileges that come with being a man, in terms of growing up watching athletes who are of the same sex as you, who you can look up to and see that they're making the highest of heights in terms of fame, money, wealth, status, achievement, all of that, and recognizing how absent that is from, the experience of girls and women growing up. Yeah, it's not as much a love for
Yes.
as much as a recognition of, what I and other men are able to enjoy without having to think deeply about it.
Very interesting. Well, Charlie, thank you for coming on the podcast. Thank you for coming on the Masking Tapes. It's been such an honor, and just definitely subscribe to Young Men's Research Initiative on Substack. Is it?
Young Men Research Initiative, yep.
On Substack, but under the Young Men Research Project, YMRP, and follow along for the incredible research that's continuing to come out and the storylines that tell what's really happening. I always look forward to reading your Substack. And thank you to Open GovHub for hosting the space of this podcast, and for Root for Good for supporting us. I am your host, Carolina Hidalgo-McCabe, and this is The Masking Tapes. Thank you.